Thanks, Alex, for inviting me and all the support from Johnny Liu and Azer. As Alex mentioned, I've had like a great pleasure of working with the team here on a variety of projects. That as I was putting this together, I was like, oh yeah, like, wow, we did that and we did this, and it's really nice to have a community of a group of people that. Um, can add the brain power to create these really rich projects and indulge my ideas. So I thought I would focus on just a few of the recent projects, and of course I wanted to talk about some of the projects that I was able to develop with Brooklyn Research as well. But just in general, in my practice, I'm really always interrogating how the built environment shapes not only like literally shapes our bodies, but also the way that we live our lives. And so this sort of built environment can be anywhere from architecture, design, and also now the sort of invisible infrastructures that really control our daily life. So that like includes, everything in the digital realm. So this sort of means that my work spans different types of, they are like, they manifest in different forms, and some of them that are more like these types of like social type spaces, some are object based, but really it's a way to think about how the experience of our lives is really a place where like all zones of life are kind of meshing into one place. So it's like includes like leisure, work, and every zone that might encompass our daily worlds. So the image that's up right now is a project that is a commission that I did through Sculpture Center. It was commissioned by Sculpture Center. This was in 2015. I think it was 2015. And I worked with Brooklyn Research and also a long-time collaborator, Eric Tsai, who does a lot of the technical back-end programming and developing aspects, the algorithmic work. But essentially, this piece was, I imagined it as a kind of, it's kind of like a social space, like a hot tub type of object that is emitting water vapor that has colored lights that are illuminate this water vapor. So the smoke, the sort of fog vapor smoke is changing color, which is actually controlled by basically it's connected to the fluctuating commodity price of gold. And so essentially you see the fluctuating price of gold through the light color. And the reason why I was sort of thinking about this was that gold itself is this a symbolic commodity. It's both a hard, actual, real material in the world, but its value is really untethered from its physicality in a sense. What it represents really is people's security or insecurity, or people's feelings about like what's happening geopolitically. So that's sort of reflected in its volatility. And at the time that I did this project, it was the summertime that the Brexit vote happened. And there was also a variety of other sort of like geopolitical events that occurred while this piece was up, like a bombing in Istanbul and other types of new political like realities of the current time. So different like natural disasters, and you could call Brexit one of those. Really reflected people's uncertainty in this moment. So it was like the highest, gold had been the highest it had been in years. And it's not really because there was a new discovery of a gold mine. It's really because people feel like it's this crisis commodity is something that people flock to make themselves feel like there's some kind of security. So there's all these kind of symbolic statements around sort of like poetic idea about the price of gold, or the material of gold, like the gold standard or that kind of thing. Like that gold represents this fake safe haven for your money. So this piece was sited in Long Island City, facing Midtown, and I really liked this idea that it's sort of the specter of the financial mecca, that you could see this bubbling cauldron of gold just floating up into the air. But it was also a hot tub that little kids like to play in. So this was a fun project to have worked with Brooklyn Research on. And this is a show that just came down, actually, that was in Istanbul, but I wanted to show this also because it shows a few pieces that a lot of my work, each piece sort of evolves into the next project or the next exhibition. So in this show and this slide, you'll see these light bulbs that are hanging down, which are also networked LED bulbs that are connected to that are changing, the light colors changing according to the quantified mood off of Twitter, based in Istanbul. So it's a geographic sort of geotagged area of Istanbul. So the lights sort of indicate the general sentiment of that city. But these light bulbs, these mood lights, which I call the Meridian series, I've been doing these for a few years, and it's sort of, I was thinking a lot about how there are these very basic architectural devices such as light and color, which are so fundamental in, not only not only like in architecture, but also just in like daily life. You encounter different types of environments which give you different kinds of mood light experiences. If you walk into an H&M, it's a certain kind of color, and if you walk into a library, it's a certain kind of light experience. So the mood light sort of like evolved out of this thinking of like how different the color of light and the sort of intensity of that can like tell you what type of space it is, and that really led to this thinking of like the mood light, like what it can indicate for you. So I worked again with Eric Tsai in creating this program that can quantify, using a sort of natural language processing. It's able to quantify the tweets that are coming out in real time of different geographic locations, and whatever the processed language is spit out as like a number, so between a range of positive and negative. And then that number is translated as light color. So pink, on the pink spectrum representing positivity, and in the green spectrum, negativity. But all of this is also kind of farcical when you think about an idea of like a mood of an entire population, like Istanbul or New York or Tokyo. Like it's a sort of something that technology is racing to try to like understand like human emotion, and to be able to even control people through this idea of like, if there's a way to quantify something that is an expression, So like something like Twitter is like an expressive text, but it's an impossibility, and it's also completely ludicrous to think that there's something that translation could actually be to capture this idea of mood or sentiment. But it's really something that is actually happening around, it's literally happening around us. So when people are able to control people through emotions, so like people talk about the Trump election and how he was able to understand like people's, this idea of sentiment. It wasn't about like facts or policy. It was really about capturing a kind of feeling, and then being able to instrumentalize social media for those purposes. So in these mood light projects, like I think a lot about both the ridiculousness, the horror of it, and also the poetics involved in like trying to show population's mood or sentiment. Because in one way, like using light that's like changing, that's constantly fluctuating, it's also uncapturable, so if you think of like something as complicated and intangible and indescribable in a sense, something like human emotion, if technology's attempt is to try to capture us in a full way, like we will also escape it. And I can't make this play for some reason. How do you make it play, the video? Oh, I clicked on it, but I double clicked on it. Space bar. Oh, this? Did that do something? No. Full screen? Like escape? It's embedded video. We also don't have to play it. But now I lost my mouse. Oh, here it is. What if I go like that? Oh, no. Well, I was just going to show how the lights were fluctuating and changing. But you can imagine. But I guess another, aspect of, like, so they're with the mood lights, using Twitter as its data source. There's something that I love about Twitter, in that it's like stupid and like it can be so many things, like the way that art can be so many things, right? It can be contradictory and extremely informative, while it's also like completely mundane and sometimes so stupid. But using these, the sort of tweets that were coming in real time in Istanbul, in a place like that where, it's basically a totalitarian state at this point. Twitter was often under attack by the government, being shut down, or like people were not able to use it, or the government was using it to track people and find, anybody who would dissent against the government. So I really like this idea of like using something that's like, open source like that, but it can be all these things like at the same time. And when I did the show in Istanbul, I had another element of the installation. I don't have an image of it, but it was a flat screen that was showing the tweets coming in that were being processed. And during installation, it was running because we were just testing all the technology and making sure everything was working. And the board of directors just did a kind of casual tour around the installation to see how things were coming together. And they saw the Twitter screen, and then everybody sort of like was paused, like a little like concerned. And I wasn't there yet. My assistant was there, and he called me. He says, "Oh, the director told me that we need to be careful about this part of the piece because Twitter is a tool that is being used and monitored all the time. So when the tour was the board of directors was walking through, some of the politicians' names were coming through, because it's like whatever was happening in the Twitter sphere in Istanbul, it was what it was getting fed into the thing, and they're really concerned about the basically the director said, if anybody sees this from the government, somebody's going to get arrested and going to jail. So that could be you as the artist, it could be me as the director, it could be the curator, it can be anybody, and we have no idea what could happen. So they were like, we're not censoring you, we're not asking you to take it down, we're just asking you to consider this very grave situation. And I was like, whoa, like I didn't even think about this aspect of when I was using Twitter in this way, like, because I was using it as a data source, not as any kind of like political statement. So, I hung up the phone and I was thinking, and then I called up Eric and I was like, okay, this is a situation, but what I was thinking is to remove all the text data and only release the emojis. So then the flat screen was only like smiley faces, thumbs down, rainbows, and coffee cups, and all these like, other kinds of like hieroglyphics basically. And it became, for me, I was like, oh, this is even better in a sense, because it became both stupider and more poetic at the same time. Like that there was nothing that the government can do at this point to stop the piece, and it wasn't even anything political anyway, but whatever smelled of like something political, had like the odor of like dissent or something. But who could shut down a smiley face video, really? Like, so for me, I really liked that, because it also, I had a conversation with somebody who was talking about how people communicate like in China by code. And really this is what all these kind of pieces like are, playing with, is this idea of like coding and poetics and translation, and like what happens within all these processes of like translation through technology and media and language itself. So emojis now, like all of us know that emojis can be both completely inane but also so powerful. So if you end a text with like "see you later" and there's like a frowny face, then you're like, oh, that's so bad, or whatever. But if it were, flowers and whatever, it's good. So it can change the tone of something completely. So I really like that sort of like evolution of that piece. So that video we couldn't show, but so this is another piece in that show. I should say the exhibition was called Ether, which is like the sort of like space above the earth, and like also like this like mythical gas. It's supposed to like permeate every aspect of our beings, basically. But in Turkish, when you translate ether, it comes out, it's called esir, which is also a double entendre in Turkish, which means prisoner. And I really liked that it actually came out that way. So like when I was giving a tour, it had like the English ether, and then underneath it says esir. And I was like, oh my God, like something that is like amorphous and intangible and free and everywhere, and then prisoner, This is like a nice little twist on that. So, and this is another piece from that show, and it is second version of a real-time animation that represents the future feeling of a population. So if the lights were real-time mood indicators, this smoke video is attempting to predict the future feeling of like this population. And I did the first version of this animation for a show I did in Tokyo, which was a smoke video, future feeling of Tokyo, and this is the future feeling of Istanbul. But essentially what's happening is it's the same kind of like algorithmic program that captures the Twitter data of this location, and then it uses predictive a predictive program to spit out another future tweet, basically, based off of statistical analysis, and then it quantifies that. So the result is that the quantified feeling is generating this sort of billowing smoke video, digital smoke. So it's like changing in color, direction, and intensity. And I think this is also a video that is not going to play, which is too bad. I think I have the file. Should I try and see? Do I have a document? Let me see. Don't look at my desktop. It's so bad. Let me move this over so you don't see my desktop. Okay. Oh, we should have tested the video, I guess. She's over here. Oh, that would be good. Is this it? I can't see where I'm standing. Oh, here. Maybe it's here. I didn't organize my laptop. Oh, here is, this looks like something. Yeah. Test Istanbul. Here's one. I think this is one of the early test videos, actually, Johnny, you sent me. I don't think it has the collision here. Well, anyway, so you can see how it kind of looks. But I like this, using smoke as this kind of metaphor, sort of like the first piece I showed, the sculpture center thing. This metaphor of smoke being uncontainable, like you can't capture it, you can't, and it's always changing. So this video itself is an endless duration, and it never repeats because it's using real-time data. And this idea of the future is also something that we can't know. We can't know, but the notion of the future shapes our present. So I was thinking about that idea of that is like the race for everybody to sort of, to win at. If everybody, if technology can figure out the future, whoever can know what's going to happen is the one who's going to control everything. So thinking of like predictive analytics and the idea of like preemptive strikes, but really all those things actually, maybe that's like sort of creating desire and creating problems in our present, even though it's about this notion of the future. So it's sort of like this idea of like having the smoke represent this constantly changing perspective, I guess. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the slide. Okay, and then let's do the slideshow. Yeah. So the screens are actually held down by these. Here we go. Held down with like dungeon straps and like steel blocks and leather. So again, sort of like pushing forward this like visual metaphor of like trying to contain or restrain that which can't be captured. This is kind of this piece is kind of like moving into the more of like the physical world versus like a sort of like immaterial world, immaterial elements, or like this idea of like emotion as a medium or material. These are more relating to the physical space around us that is in some ways like both like archaic, but also to remind us in a sense that like as much as like we live in like a sort of in the world of our like computation and computers and like the ether of like the internet and whatever, like there's still like the physicality of like our bodies and where we are. So this sculpture is a sort of, there's a series of these sculptures actually, which are sort of meditations on like the control of like ergonomics and design and architecture and like the sort of contradictions of contemporary life in that. So this wooden sculpture in the front is a kind of replica of this new design system that's kind of being implemented in corporate interior design, like where in the sort of like modernist era in like the 70s and 80s, like the cubicle form and the cubicle sort of office plan was like the exemplified sort of like, efficient, an efficient way for people to work. And then now like it's so progressed and evolved that people work, you don't really need that kind of place to work. You're kind of working all the time on your iPhone or your laptop, and you're working in the train station, in a cafe, co-working, airport lounges, wherever. So this design system that was created is based off this different type of transitory seating. And then this is like the sort of like emblematic chair design for them, and it's called the social chair, which is a cross shape, but if you sit at this thing, you're facing away from each other, so it's like already sort of like the opposite of social. It's anti-social. And then it's peppered with these jacuzzi jet nozzles, which is like, again, the sort of metaphor of like energy pushing outward and like through, and using this notion of like self-care and leisure mixed with like corporate life, I guess. So different views of that. And this is like some Herman Miller press releases that I collect that talk about progressive design as a just sort of like reference material for the new regime. And with this sort of like ergonomic series that I have been doing are these sculptures called the Pranayama series. And they're basically amalgams of prosthetics, robotics, body braces, and like sex fetish restraint kind of objects. And for me, these really exemplify like our relationship with technology, in that it's like a fine line between like control and submission and pleasure and pain and all those things, and like repair, assistance, efficiency, progress, assistant. Did I say assistance? I did. Yeah, sorry. Care and submission, which I said already too. But so this is like a kind of an amalgam of those types of. I've done different sculptures that are like related to these things, and again peppered with jacuzzi jet nozzles. So it's this idea of like it. This is like penetrating your body. And an installation of gold-chromed jacuzzi jet nozzles embedded into the wall that are emitting pressurized air. So these are, this series title is called Force Touch, which is like the title comes from Apple's haptic technology that they developed, which is this idea of, it's a touch that kind of like touches you back, so you have this feeling of like a responsive, something that's responding to you, versus like you're activating it, it's kind of like activating you. Like, so if you think of like video games that use a lot of haptic technology. But for me, I really like this metaphor of this invisible pressure, like this wind and sound that you encounter that is like you can't see, but it's a force that it's completely palpable. So these are laid out in a diagram of acupuncture pressure points, meridian points, which is also this idea of like the micro kind of architecture or map of how energy flows through your body, and like that there's some kind of holistic way that you can control the larger part of your well-being or your energy through something like a map on your hand. So I've done a couple series of these. This is from my show in Tokyo, 2 hands again like this. And so when you enter the space, the first thing you actually encounter is like the sound of the fans that are emitting this pressurized air. And then the next thing you encounter is the wind. I mean, I guess you could see it too, but it's like looking at it has less of an impact in a slide than is when you enter the space and feel that sort of like, it sounds like you are in either like an airplane or a yoga studio, which are both things that I think are really related in that way. And going back to like the pranayama series with the wood pranayama series, I've been thinking a lot about how, or like using the metaphor of controlling the breath, or like this is like pranayama means that in yoga or Ayurvedic practice, it's like the control of breath, which is like the life force. So there's this attempt in our lives now that there is everything, there is sort of a logic and way to control all that is inexplainable, and like the force of, life itself. And then, this painting series, which is not actually painting, but again, going to this notion of like translation and data getting processed. This series is called the Negative Entropy series, and it is essentially an acoustic portrait. So what I do is I visit various types of production sites, and for each show or each body of work, I kind of focus on a set of different types of production sites. Like first started with industrial factories and data centers. So the sort of like transition from like an industrial economy to like the sort of information technology that is the new kind of factory. To now I'm working on recordings from a fusion energy company in California that's attempting to harness like fusion energy to produce electricity, as well as the voice of translators, which is like this idea of like language passing through another person's body. So I take these recordings and I process them with an audio program, an open source audio program that makes these into spectrograms. And then I work with a weaver, and she further translates those into her loom program, and and they're woven as these kind of tapestries, these woven pieces. So this is actually a portrait of the sound of Kim Reddick, who is a person who works at a factory translating images into Jacquard punch cards, which is like one of the early digital forms of programs that run a loom. So this is the sound of her working. This is a portrait of this famous Japanese translator named Kazue Kobata, who is really important in the Tokyo avant-garde scene, and she brought a lot of Japanese artists and to the U.S., and vice versa, brought artists and thinkers and writers to Japan. So she was instrumental in sort of that translation process. So really like culture and language was really passing through her, and she was never like this it was always about the production of somebody else's work. but she was obviously an integral aspect of bringing all this culture back and forth. And so I liked having this portrait of this person that's not an image of her face, but the sound of her voice. And this is a portrait of DigitalOcean Data Center, which is here in New York. So I like to, when I do a project or an exhibition, it's often like to have these pieces like in relation to each other. So this is an installation I did at the Palais de Tokyo last year. So the light, or the gallery was lit by the Meridian mood lights, capturing the mood of Paris at the time. So the light temperature was constantly changing, which was also like affecting the way that you would view the paintings, view the negative entropy series on the wall. So this is one of the first mood light sculptures that I did, which was at my gallery in Tokyo. And for this show, I was experimenting with what the actual sculptural form of the mood light could be. And I was really thinking about how if the mood lights were representing like this population of, say, for the show, it was in Tokyo, so I did Paris and Brasilia, were the two cities I was reflected the mood of. But if it was to represent this population, which is sort of like a disembodied, like amorphous, like huge entity, then it's sort of like housed in this object that kind of is this alien form that still has some kind of like vestiges of like biomorphic human form. So it's I use the sort of parts of these ergonomic chairs that are being used in a lot of corporate design, I guess. So it's like a setu chair that's deconstructed as the sort of like skeleton for these light sculptures. Yeah. Let's see. How am I doing on time? Have I been talking for a long time? Keep going? Okay, cool. Let me know, because I have totally lost track of how long I've been talking. So another series that I often incorporate into these projects are the Art de Meublement painting series, which is like seen behind the mood light piece here. And this painting series also comes out of the research I did related to the various architectural devices that are used in designing spaces. So one of the key things, going back to like, I mentioned like light being this important aspect of designing a space or thinking about what designates the use of the space. Paint and paintings, paint color are also one of these sort of elemental aspects of design and architecture. And so I started thinking about how these very basic things like painting, and color are instrumentalized, and how I could sort of meditate on these things that create an ambience or tell you what type of space you're in when you encounter these paintings or the paint color itself. So the paintings are these very basic forms that I use in industrial produced clear PETG frame that is sort of made by thermoform which is a type of like packaging process in industrial production. It's often used, like, if you think of like blister packs for, like, you know, your headphones or you know, other kinds of like things you buy at the store that come in this like plastic shell case. That's thermoforming. And I really like this idea that painting could also could be this sort of shell of itself, like painting in its most elemental form, which is just pigment in a box kind of shape. So it's spray enamel captured inside of a clear plastic box. And I've been sort of just using very basic color combinations in gradient. And then the series title, Art de Meublement, refers to Eric Satie, who's a modernist composer who coined the idea of ambient music. It was like he was like an early modernist composer. And when he thought of this idea of like ambient music, he thought of it as like oral decor. It was supposed to sync to the background for other activities. So back in the day, people would go to see chamber music and he would sit down in front of the musicians and watch the musicians and listen to the music. But he's like, no, this music is actually for the background. So other activities are happening. It's a dinner party. It's some other performance is happening. There's a lecture. There's a conversation, whatever. So I love this idea that like painting would be this thing that sets the tone, the mood, and sinks into the background. So these paintings, the way they're painted, actually reveals like the box part of themselves. So like the bottom or the top of the frame, it shows you the wall behind, and the frame itself, this like sort of just cheap, not cheap, it's expensive to make, but you know, plastic is cheap. So that this frame is revealing that and the reflective surface itself is like revealing that this is to set the mood of the place, or it's this architectural device. And each of these paintings is actually subtitled with a geographic location. So what once appeared as like just abstract orange and blue, yellow and peach, suddenly is imbued with all these like psychogeographic connotations. So it becomes representational, and it has this feeling to it, because it's like the orange one is, Atlanta, and the yellow one is, I forgot the actual locations, but imagine that the yellow one is Hawaii or something like that. And suddenly you have this image in your head that's related to those colors, and it gives you a kind of feeling. So it's like this idea of like how if you go to like Home Depot to buy white paint for your walls, and there's like 50 different types of white paint, all white paint, but you choose the one that kind of gives you this feeling, like Aspen or St. Moritz or, sand, it has like some kind of like, it makes you feel like it's something else rather than white paint. So it's like this device that painting can really manipulate you in a way that you weren't, that you had not intended. Well, I might end it with that. But yeah, just these days really thinking about emotion as a medium, and yeah, while I'm making these sort of like things that have like physical, like translated into sort of like immaterial things translated into physical material objects. Also the other way around, where the data and the hard numbers become like things that like you can't capture. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions for Mika?
Pretty basic, but I guess what are you kind of working on now and developing in terms of your next project?
I'm working on this project I'm super excited about, but it's also like in the beginning stages. I'm still working on, I'm I've got these new negative entropies I'm working on. Very exciting. I just went to California to do these recordings of this fusion place. And I'm going to a robotics place, like a prosthetics robotics place, to do some recordings as well. So that's ongoing. But I'm working on this other kind of long-term project based off of like the algorithmic work that I've been doing. And it's with Cornell Tech. So I have these two amazing developers who are coders who are working with me, and the idea that I haven't developed like the physical form yet of what it is, but essentially the back-end technology is really to think about if like with all of what's going on with our data and our emotions and like our input into like the cloud and the internet, like that they're trying to capture and understand people as like profiles. And so the technology that we're working on right now is like using clustering algorithms to sort of try to see if we can beat or like hide amongst all the algorithms that try to understand like who we are as people, you know? So like if you like hot dogs and smashing pumpkins, then you're gonna like these socks or something, you know, like how that happens in like Amazon or whatever on the internet. So like I'm really interested, I'm trying to see if we can try to, well, it's like an impossible poetic exploration of like trying to capture and escape and evade it by using all these like different kinds of algorithmic processes, clustering algorithms, to show the sort of like the madness of like trying to understand us as people, as human beings, not as profiles. So essentially the project is going to be like using these algorithms that create new humans, new kinds of people, beings. And then I think the visualization of that is going to be these like water droplets that are like clumping together, but acting against their nature as well. So it's like what is going against its nature is like what water wants to do, which is flow. So that's one thing that I'm thinking of right now. Yeah.
Anyone else?
So this is kind of a question, but sort of a bit of a lead-in. When I'm looking at your work and really thinking about some of the things that you're dealing with in terms of predictive analysis, and then recently what you're talking about with expert systems and some of these ideas, it really makes me think a lot about Claude Shannon and some of the really foundational work that he did in terms of information theory, which really made all of this stuff happen, for better or worse. But I think about a quote of his, which I thought might be relevant, which is in which he said something, I think along the lines that we can know the past but cannot change it. We can change the future but cannot know it.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's something I oftentimes think about with predictive analysis, in that right now with the current state of technology, we're sort of in this conundrum where we can either have very, very large sample size, being able to see a very vast view of the world or of a situation, but a very low sample rate. Or we can have a very high sample rate, but a very small area that we can look at. Going on the promises of big data and knowing that the better that those two things get, in theory, we should be able to extend our horizon of predictive power in some way. So if it really is just a matter of computational power, and with the things like quantum computers on the horizon, what is your feeling in terms of, is that sort of a hopeful future, or something that is still kind of maybe more dark? That's a tough question, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, it's a little of both, right? Like,
No, definitely.
yeah, it's sort of like, I've been thinking about the both sides of the coin, you know, like one side is like, it's like the smoke thing, right? Like you want to capture, but you can't. You want to evade it, but you want to know. And then, yeah, I think I've been thinking about like if we can use like machine learning and AI and algorithms like to be able to try to see more, or which is like a different thing. It's almost like the most like fundamental thing of like try to understand somebody else's point of view style, like in a way, like this idea of like if you're able to like really see more so you can understand more. So like that was one thing, like also with the election, like we're like, what, how could that have happened, like I didn't see that coming. But then there were people then that I guess that were like, well actually, like, you know, you just weren't paying attention or whatever. But yeah, so like there's this like metaphor in that like, or there's a lot of people that are trying to study like what can machines in machine learning, what are they seeing and what's happening inside that box. Like we want to know it's processing things, but we don't really understand it. We don't know because we have our own like neurological processes are also not completely understood. But what people are building, people don't know how it's happening either. So there's this sort of like an excitement and something that could be good in that, like that we can try to understand and see more. But of course, the negative side is then they're going to kill us. Robots will rule us. But so yes, I don't know if it's. I think it's both. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
If you could talk a bit more about the decisions to make certain data collecting live feed and other ones like succinct moments, like recordings in time, like how you use you think about the two kinds of time views.
Well, so the portrait series, gosh, there's so much to say. Sometimes I forget to say some really important things like that. So like the weavings, the portrait series, it's also, I'm thinking a lot about obsolescence and death. And that's what those pieces are, right? It's like a portrait is like freezing something in time, an active moment in time. Like you capture that image of something. It's incomplete, but it's the essence of something or someone or that moment in time. And then it already, once it's captured, it's already speaking to its obsolescence. You know, it's like death is imminent, you know, and that's what is happening all the time with technology itself. So like rendering those pieces using, you know, something like technology to capture something fleeting and ephemeral like audio, translating into something material and hard, and then using technology to weave it, which is also kind of like immortalizing something, using something that is also going to be obsolete. You know, this machine that's making this thing is going out of date, like as you speak. So I like this, that it's sort of like the method of making something is also speaking to its concept, I guess. And with the real-time things, again, that's also the same there. So like thinking of like the mood lights, it's about like that it's always changing and that it's not the same, and it's that time is also part of the work, like that it can never be fully captured, and that the data is infinite, and that's why, yeah, that's why I use that. So it's, you can feel that that it's relevant at that moment, you know, particularly like if we go back to thinking of like the Istanbul thing, like that intensity of like the Twitter feed thing is because it's in real time, you know, because like yeah, because of its real-time nature. Yeah.
So thinking about the recording idea,
Mhm.
also, like, are you, let's say that show in Istanbul ran for 5 weeks or something,
Mhm.
are you recording the changes in the lighting? Is it something that could be replayed, like those 5 weeks in Istanbul 10 years from now?
Yeah, we have been, I haven't been keeping track very closely, but Eric is really meticulous about that, and we can go back and like see that recorded time. So like we are kind of like dealing with that right now. This idea of like this was that time period, because at some point also that technology for my lights are gonna go.
Right, I was thinking like Twitter won't.
Yeah, and what if Twitter stops
Right.
like being a company? So we have like that recorded data like somewhere in my server thing somewhere. And actually, this is like the next sort of thing I want to work on with Brooklyn Research is like a sort of like the snapshot version of the mood lights. So it can be like this was this time period, and
Right.
this is what this looked like at this time. Thinking about partially about the obsolescence of any of those things, Twitter, Hue, whatever, and also that there are some like practical matters, like if a museum has it and we don't have those, if Twitter doesn't exist anymore, then I can't.
It's almost like a performance that
Yeah,
only exists.
right. Like
So
I
how do
like
you
to call
document it?
those pieces like plants, or like they're kind of alive really, because it's like constantly being fed and it has to be connected and you have to care for it, or like a Tamagotchi, you know. If you disconnect it, then if it doesn't have the data and if it doesn't have the internet, then it's just a light that's doing nothing. So those are some like things that now I'm dealing with as like I've done this series for a few years. I'm like starting to face like the real possibility of like, you know, changes or disconnecting or whatever. So yeah, I have to address that, which is why I have to have a meeting with Brooklyn Research soon.
Anyone else? No. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.